I've made it no secret on my channel that I'm not a big fan of multicolor 3D printing, mainly because of all of the waste that's involved in the process. Practically all multicolor capable printers use one hot end, which means switching between colors through a single nozzle. That constant swapping generates a lot of purge material, leading to unnecessary waste. One of the exceptions to these multicolor printers is the Prusa XL, with its ability to flip between 5 hot ends. So today we're going to be taking a thorough look at this machine to see exactly how it works, what kinds of prints and quality it's capable of, and if this should be the way forward for all multicolor 3D printers in the future. With unique printers come unique unboxing experiences, apparently. There's a rip strip around the base of the box that allows for a fairly easy unboxing of the machine. This is the assembled version of the printer, so the main body is already together. We also have this sweet little bonus of an entire kilogram of gummy bears, which do come in handy later because we still have quite a bit of work to do on this machine with installing all of these hot ends. This is the 5-tool head version of the Prusa XL, which is what these 5 boxes are off to the side. We've also got a kilogram of Prusa Mint PLA tucked into the top, and in that same upper section of the packaging, there's also this really nicely bound 3D printing handbook that comes with some cool stickers in the front and a lot of great information inside, both on this machine and 3D printing in general. This upper section is also where the LCD screen is packed. Then turning this printer around to the front, this cardboard section is where we have a lot of goodies packed into. We've got a nice set of tools, some parts and accessories, some smaller pieces, a power cord, USB stick, and some transport helpers. Just a couple of more pieces of cardboard to remove, and then we have the printer base all ready to start assembling some of these parts onto, starting off with the LCD screen. We'll need this pack of M3 screws as well as some tools to install the screen onto the printer. I'm going to start out by plugging in these 2 cables that you can see sticking out of the front of the printer onto the back of the screen. From there, it's just inserting those M3 bolts through the holes in the side of the screen to then attach to the nuts that are already installed on the front of the printer body. And now it is time to start working on installing all of those extruders. In each of these 5 boxes, we have the main hot end assembly, a silicone sock for the hot end, the docking piece that also has the PTFE tube and cable installed on it, and a telescopic spool holder. We're going to start by working with the cable assembly, and more specifically the docking piece, which is this black part. Now, this version of the printer actually has the bolts already installed into this piece, so all I'm going to have to do is line this dock up with the first screw hole on the back of the printer and insert a hex key into the center hole to start tightening that bolt onto the machine. I know, it's a bit difficult to show what I'm doing here, but because this is the 5-tool head version of this Prusa XL, it means that I'm now repeating the exact same steps an additional 4 times. Something that was extremely stressed in the instructions was the importance of making sure these docks were installed like rock solid tight, and originally I did think I had them tightened as much as possible, but then I would wiggle it front and back as you see me doing right here, and I realized there was still a bit of play, and so I really was wrenching on that hex key to try and get these as tight and solid as possible. So if you're working on installation of these parts, don't just wiggle it side to side, go front to back and you will see if there is any play there. And after all of that, I absolutely needed a gummy bear break. But continuing on with assembly, next up is the Wi-Fi antenna. And here you can see me looking at my phone because there are extremely extensive instructions on this printer online from Prusa. So while I am still going to show you the entire process of setting up the machine, just know that in this case it actually wasn't a very necessary thing, because I think reading the instructions that Prusa have made themselves online, it would be more than sufficient when it comes to any information that you need to know. So that is the Wi-Fi antenna pre-assembled, but now we're going to flip to the back of the printer again and loosen these 4 bolts that are holding this back section together, as well as these 2 upper ones. I say loosen because you don't actually need to remove the bolts fully because the covers have keyholes. In this upper section, I'm plugging in the cables for the first and second extruder. Then I'm going to slide this bigger back cover off because the Wi-Fi assembly that we just worked on actually screws into the upper section, but the small wire hanging out goes from the upper section back down into this lower area where you then need to plug it in. The remaining 3 extruder cables also get plugged into the circuit board that is located in this section on the back of the printer. There are a lot of cables that are located in this one section, so I did try and do a little bit of cable management before replacing that back cover onto the printer, and from there retightened all of those bolts again to keep that cover in place. Next up was installing the Wi-Fi antenna itself, which just screws onto that back plate that's already been installed on the printer. Then it was on to inserting the PTFE tube ends from that whole cable assembly into the side sensors in the correct corresponding order with the sensor label. 1, 2, and 3 go to one side and 4 and 5 go to the other. And then it was on to installing all of these spool holders. These are geniusly designed. They're telescopic, which means you're going to be able to put a variety of different spool sizes onto them. To install these, you start by inserting these spring nuts into the side extrusion. They do move around quite freely, so you can mess with exactly where you want these different spool holders to actually be on the sides of your printer. The spool holder itself is in 2 pieces that you sort of just slide in together and they click in place, and then the bolt you insert through the middle of that entire piece that sticks out the bottom, and then you just screw that onto the nut on the side of the printer. And repeating those exact same steps 5 times, of course. I do have to say, none of the assembly is particularly difficult. It just ends up being a bit time consuming, especially when you do have the 5 tool head version, because you're having to repeat a variety of steps multiple times. Next thing I did was install the silicone socks onto all of the hot ends, and then you take those entire hot end extruder assembly parts and they somewhat end up magnetically attaching to the dock pieces that we just installed on the machine. There are 2 pins that stick out of the side of the piece that just go into the holes in the dock, and then it was on to installing the plastic support tie and as well as plug in the cable. So you start by loosening the 2 screws that are on the front of each of these extruder assemblies, because this plastic tie once again uses a keyhole. So you just have to loosen those to get that tie piece on, and then pull it up so it's nice and tight, and then re-tighten those bolts, and of course repeat that another 5 times. You can also insert the PTFE tube onto the top of this assembly, and then the cable just plugs into this upper side part. And again, those are steps that you're going to be repeating for every single one of these tool heads. And with that, assembly is complete. All that's left to do is plug in the machine, turn it on, and now we can start the setup and calibration process. Starts off pretty standard with language selection, then it actually goes into nozzle information, so I made sure to check off that I had installed the silicone socks. Next, you can connect it to your Wi-Fi network as well as a Prusa Connect if you'd like. And then we get into the test and calibration process, which I do have to say is quite extensive compared to a lot of machines, just from the nature of how complex this entire printer is with its ability to flip between these hot ends. First was leveling out the silicone nozzle wiper parts. This is done by loosening or tightening bolts on the side of this whole assembly. You want them to basically be level and flush with the nozzle, because this is going to stop any of the filament from oozing out places where you don't want it to be. Next up were all of the dock calibrations, which you need these 2 wrenches for, and I do have to say the screen runs you through this setup process beautifully. First up was loosening these pins with that guitar pick looking wrench, and both of these pins you want to loosen to the point where you can actually remove them. Next up was loosening the 2 nuts that are on the side of the dock. Started off by using the wrench, but then just went in with my fingers to loosen them up. Next, you need to manually move by hand the front connection part of this whole extruder thing, the part that basically picks up this piece. Lock the 2 side pins into place and then tighten that upper nut. Once you finish that and press continue, it will actually move the whole extruder head away from that docking part so that you can then go in and tighten that lower nut. Next, you also need to reinstall those 2 pins. And once you hit continue and you've said that's being completed, it will move the print head back to the dock and then go back and forth a few times, making sure that it can properly load and unload onto the dock. And again, this is a process that will need to be repeated for every single one of the docks and extruders. Next up is the load cell test, which involves you tapping the end of the nozzle on command. It did take me a little bit to get this timing right, but overall, again, a super simple process and one that you will be repeating for all of the hot ends. Next was the filament sensor calibrations. So I grabbed the roll of PLA that actually came with the printer to use, and all this test involved was inserting some filament into the various PTFE tubes to just make sure that the filament runout sensors on each of the nozzles was appropriately working. Then it was on to the tool offset calibrations. This involves having you remove the magnetic build plate so that you can install the calibration pin into the center of the bed segments. And this just ends up screwing into place. Once you've hit continue on the machine, it will home the nozzle to this calibration pin and begin almost probing it to make sure it knows exactly where this hot end is in relation to everything else. I've sped this up so you can see exactly what it does. So it sort of starts off by probing around, but then it goes back and forth between the edges of the pin to the center. A pretty unique calibration process, but if it works, it works. And this is again something that needs to be repeated for every single one of the hot ends. Once it's run through all of that, you can go ahead and remove the calibration pin, reinstall the heat bed, and this is when it will start doing its phase stepping calibrations. This is somewhat similar to input shaping. It is testing out the vibrations of the motors to try and minimize them as best possible. And after that, setup is complete. So let's actually get something printing on this machine. You may have noticed that one of the things not included in the initial setup process was bed leveling, and that is because it automatically levels the bed before every single print job, which would sometimes maybe annoy me because it's taking extra time before every print. But in this case, I am perfectly fine with it because I have never seen a more perfect layer be put down on a 3D printer ever. Like, the level of perfection of those first layers was unbelievable. And even beyond the first layers, these prints themselves just looked so unbelievably perfect. Like, they're almost to the point that you can't even tell they're 3D printed. That is how flawless the sides of these prints looked. And of course, you can see the absolutely perfectly smooth bottom that these pieces have as well. Same for the top layer, and these were using basically all default settings. The only thing I modified was the filament temperature to better suit the PLA that I was using for these. And after having these single color parts turn out so beautifully, I decided to jump right into a multicolor print. Now, annoyingly, when I started this print job, I had to leave before I got to actually witness the tool change, but regardless of that, again, these prints turned out beautifully. This black was actually the Prusa Mint in Galaxy Black that came with the printer, printed really nice. The lid with the text in the different color, again, just so clean. That first layer looks so incredible. You basically can't tell that it's printed. The inside of this was a little rough in places, but just the sides and just overall, a really, really gorgeous looking print. And all of the parts that you've seen me print so far are actually to create a toolbox, specifically for all of the tools that you get with this machine. They're actually very nice tools, I have to say, and so having a specific box to house all of them so that I know everything for this printer is in a safe and secure place, I figured was not a half bad idea, and also made for a really nice test print. The orange dividers just sit on top of that open section, and these smaller ones are actually meant to house the nozzles if you want to take them out of the packaging. Looking a little sparse in that section, but I've got room to expand if I want to. Next, I wanted to jump into a much more complex multicolor print, this time a battle droid head, which I know you might be thinking, hey, did you not just print one of these in color? And yes, I did, and that's kind of why I wanted to print another one, although this time I decided to go for the Geonosis color scheme. But since this is something that I've already printed, I know exactly the time and material that it took to make one of these with a more traditional type of multicolor printer. And that ended up being 79 hours with over a kilogram of wasted purge material. For comparison, here are my estimates from Prusa Slicer for how much material and time this project should take. And this actually isn't even really a good one-to-one comparison because this print job is actually printing more than that 79-hour print job was. So even though this machine is technically running at a slightly slower print speed just by default, it's not that it can't print faster, it's just default, this is what it's printing at, and I didn't feel like changing it. It's making up for all of that lost time because of just how fast it can switch between colors. Here you can see it's taking just around 15 seconds to switch between one tool head to the next, and that is mostly due to the extra time spent on the quite large wipe tower base. It will be even faster when the wipe tower starts to thin out towards its peak, and seeing this machine switch between tool heads is just such an unbelievable and cool experience. It feels like something that you should not be able to have in your own home. And yeah, those 10 to 15 seconds that it takes to switch between colors is like lightning fast. Most other multicolor printers, it's like a minute and 20 to a minute and 40 seconds. So 10 to 15 is like absolutely no time at all. And because it's physically switching between hot ends, it means there is none of that purge material being created. The only waste that it's producing is on that wipe tower, which has a few purposes. It's stopping any filament buildup from accumulating around the docking, but it's also priming the nozzle to ensure the most ideal and flawless print job, which I think we've gathered at this point. It's doing a pretty darn incredible job of the flawless print job situation. The one downside with multicolor printing is you are subject to the colors of filament that are available. So while I did really like the color of this particular like terracotta, I was not a humongous fan of the finish. It's pretty shiny for what I would have liked to have gone with for this droid. In the future, I'm probably going to try a mattifying spray to calm it down a little because it's looking a little too factory fresh for my liking. On this print job, for some reason, these back head parts had this one line. Now, I did notice this when it was printing, but it didn't seem to have affected any of the other pieces. So I'd wondered if it was some sort of like G-code or slicing error. So I took the exact same file and just printed off those two parts again, but these turned out perfectly fine. So I'm not entirely sure what was wrong with the first ones, but I have a set of these back parts that look absolutely flawless now. So I guess we're just going to have to live with the mystery. But from the original print job bed, this was what the wipe tower looked like. Now, it did automatically generate these fins to better support the entire structure, which is really great, not me complaining. It ends up being very hollow though. Like in total, this entire wipe tower only weighed 78 grams. And honestly, I thought it was going to weigh a lot more. So 78 grams as opposed to like the 1200 grams from the last time I did this blasted droid print is absolutely insane. I did go ahead and continue printing the remaining of the pieces that I needed to complete the whole head display. These were all a single color though. And here is what that battle droid head looks like fully assembled. So not only did the multicolor parts print faster due to the 10-second filament change as opposed to like the minute plus, but it also saved me like $30 in filament when it didn't end up using an extra kilogram in waste. And while I do think the filament is too shiny, it is giving a great example as to how flawless these prints are. This printer unfortunately doesn't have a camera built in, so I just ended up using one of my extra wise cams, which worked out so well on the edge here because it has a magnetic base already and that is a metal piece of printer, so it just sits and magnetizes and is super secure there. But it did mean I had that wire that was sort of just hanging down, so I wanted to do a bit of cable management. So I printed an extra long extrusion cover that worked absolutely perfectly. I could run the cable inside, cover it all up. It looks like this piece should have always been there, and it cleans it up just really nicely. Such an easy little camera addition. This machine was printing so well for me that I just started using it for anything that I needed, so I decided I needed an iPad stand, so I printed it in this really cool duochrome galaxy looking filament. This might be like my favorite filament ever, and yeah, turned out great. Works perfectly for what I need it for. Something that I just wanted to highlight on this printer was how to remap filament, because originally I wasn't actually sure if you could. So when you select a print job, you press continue and it brings up your filament list. If you want to change that, you select the printer tools and then just press replace. Not the most intuitive thing, but it also never asks you for color, so it would never be able to instinctively know that, hey, this is supposed to be printing white, so it wants to replace the, say, second slot with the third slot if that is what the white is installed on. And this next printed piece is this like history of troopers sign, and because this printer has a 360mm cubed build volume, it meant that I could print this quite large. So this turned out once again beautifully. Such a cool display piece, but also pretty simple, and I really wanted to do something insane, something that I would normally never choose to print in color because of all of the unnecessary waste and time that would be involved in that process. But since that is like so minimized with this machine, I managed to convince myself to just go for it with this armor figure. This is like this jumbo cartoony figure. I did scale it up quite a lot so that we could see the just general print volume that this machine's capable of, but just also all of the detail and have it be a quite impressive project. And this was one of the coolest things to see printing in all of the colors. Again, this is not something I would have normally ever considered printing before, but this was in particular A pretty interesting project for me to choose because this is also something I probably wouldn't choose to make if I was sanding it. So I think the only way that I would have ever decided to have made this as a display piece would be in this way, with it being printed in color. Not to say that you couldn't choose to print it in a single color, sand it, prime it, paint it, and all of that. It wouldn't be something that I would have chosen to do. But it already being those colors, I was very on board for, and this turned out so cool. I was very worried about the support because it is quite a complex piece. I mean, this thing looked crazy with the support material, but you can see here, the support is just falling off of this practically. It's coming off so easily. The support and the settings for this machine were just so dialed in well. Like, I really was not changing anything. Super minimal, and the bottom sections of these parts looked so great, and this was using all 5 colors. So very, very cool to see this like in person, just how it turned out. So smooth. I probably don't need to tell you all of that. And here is what the waist was like for this piece. This one did feel significantly more solid than the other one. I think it was because it was having to switch between more than 2 colors on some layers, but even then it still only came out to 94 grams. And that could have been it for this entire project, but I decided to maximize my color potential by printing the helmet separately so that I could flip to having 2 additional colors, the gold and black for the helmet. The silver I left the same, but I do suppose that that is a slight downside with this machine, is that you are maxed out at 5 colors, which honestly for me is generally more than enough. I think there's only ever been one project outside of this one that I've needed more than 5 colors for, and most of the time you can get away with just printing things separately to get those additional colors on a single project. Again, this turned out to be an absolutely gorgeous print, and overall just a super fun display piece that I now have in my workshop. Final tally for waist for this, it was 29 grams for the helmet, so in total just over 100 grams for the 2 parts. For comparison's sake, the estimate for the same colored body piece on another multicolor printer has it wasting 530 grams. That is almost 5 times the wasted filament on just the body piece, not the body and the helmet. Not to mention it also apparently would have taken almost twice the print time. So I'm not going to be printing another one of these on a different machine, but this one I am very happy with the outcome of. It has been an amazing few weeks with the Prusa XL. I've already put a couple hundred hours on this machine, but even then I feel like I've hardly scratched the surface of this printer's capabilities. For this video, I did just stick to multicolor printing, although this printer is very capable of multi-material as well. Originally, I was planning on doing a PLA print with PEDG supports because they don't really like sticking together, and so it makes support removal very easy, but as you saw throughout this video, the supports were coming off so beautifully that I just didn't see the need in going through with that plan. But I am very interested in looking at multi-material prints in the future, specifically on this machine, since it does make switching between multiple filaments or multiple colors just so easy, especially because there are just so many interesting and useful combinations when it comes to multi-material printing. Printing supports in another type of filament or even dissolvable supports is sort of like the base level of where it starts, but from there you can start printing with flexible filaments in combination with rigid ones for different projects. Or I've even seen an example of using one filament on the outside of the piece and another for the infill. I believe the idea was that you could save on the cost of quite an expensive filament if you liked the look of it by not having to use it for the infill as well. So just a lot of very interesting multi-material applications that this machine would be great for. I would love to know if any of you have multi-material project suggestions that you would like to see me try and make. I have realized, not particularly recently, that I am pretty boring when it comes to my material choices. For me, 3D printing ends up being an amazing tool for my prop building and costume making purposes, and therefore material choices are just kind of boring and solid and not very interesting combination-wise. I mean, you have people 3D printing on fabric and making all of these amazing creations, and there just hasn't been anything that has come up on my project list to be doing things like that, but I am very interested in looking at all all of the crazy and amazing possibilities that you can create with machines and combinations of materials, because I'm sure at some point a combination is going to be very useful for some particular prop or costume build for me. So yeah, if you've got any multi-material ideas that you'd like to see me make, please let me know in the comments. There is actually an enclosure you can purchase for this machine to make it even more material capable. Personally, I probably wouldn't end up looking at using this ever for ABS or anything like that, so I'm not bothered by it being an open design, but I know some of you are more interested in printing with those engineering filaments that require those higher temperatures and an enclosure, so just wanted to make sure that I mentioned the enclosure availability as well. Something else that I really wanted to mention in this video is this was one of the few machines that I actually looked up videos for beforehand. The Prusa XL is just an insane printer. It's unlike anything on the market right now, and definitely unlike any other 3D printer that I currently own. So I wanted to kind of see what I was getting myself into. And what I ended up seeing is a lot, if not the majority of the videos that you will see pop up about the Prusa XL are more from its initial launch, and there were quite a few issues with those original machines, and as far as I can tell, Prusa has basically completely resolved any issue that I believe I saw mentioned from any of those videos. Now, that is not me saying to not go watch those videos, because I think gathering a collection of information from a whole bunch of sources is always important, but I'm not sure if I've ever seen a 3D printer go through so many changes and improvements as this Prusa XL, which is not a complaint. Good on Prusa for resolving any of the issues and concerns that people had with its initial round of machines. I even noticed it when going through the instruction guide, because it would say that, oh, you might have the machine that has this version of this connector, or it might have this, and so go to this section if you have this kind. So I'm assuming now all of the versions of the machines are going to be similar to mine, if not even improved upon in the future. But yeah, even things like the original wave of XLs were shipping out with 0.6mm nozzles, and now they're all 0.4. Just a bunch of little things like that. So if you are someone that's going to be continuing down your Prusa XL research, just keep that in mind. The people making videos 8+ months ago, it's not like they didn't know what to do with their machine. It's just gone through a lot of improvements since then, and same for now. Anyone that's doing a video on the Prusa XL now, it's not like they're lying about their experience. It's just there's been so many great improvements made between the software and the hardware for this printer that everyone is just having different experiences depending on when they ended up with this machine. But now let's get into some of the pros and cons of this 3D printer. I'm sure it's going to be no surprise that one of the biggest pros for this machine is just how insanely fast filament changes are, and also how little waste there is compared to every other multicolor capable printer on the market right now. The Prusa XL can flip between its hot ends in 10 to 15 seconds depending on how much it's doing on the wipe tower. For all of the other multicolor printers that I've tried, it averages out somewhere between 1:20 to 1:40 per filament color change. So that is obviously quite a time save, especially when you are looking at prints having hundreds, if not thousands, of filament changes per print. And then of course there's the huge benefit of this machine not needing to create any of those little poop purge bits, because it's not flipping between colors on the single nozzle, it's literally flipping nozzles. It does still make that wipe tower, which I would say is pretty necessary still, although I never ended up adjusting any of the default values, so it is possible that the wasted amount for the wipe tower could be lowered further. And even though the wipe tower is still waste, it is a fraction of the waste caused by other multicolor printers that also still use some sort of like wipe or purge tower anyway. Another massive positive for this printer is all of the settings seem to be incredibly well dialed in. You've been seeing the prints that I've been getting off of this machine throughout this video. They are some of the most perfect 3D prints I have ever gotten. The first layers were absolutely flawless. The support material was coming off so easily and really not leaving a ton of scarring on the bottoms of prints. I absolutely do not have an issue proclaiming the Prusa XL to easily be top 3, if not top spot for print quality that I have ever seen on one of the 3D printers that I have tried out. It really is just that good. Depending on the piece and also filament type and texture, you can sometimes see a little bit of like VFAs, like that little rippling on the edges, but then I will look at the same piece in some other lighting and not be able to see anything at all. So overall, just like insanely perfect print quality, and those were with majority default default settings. The only settings I ended up modifying were infill, walls, if it needed supports or not, you know, just the basic level settings that I would be modifying on a print by print basis anyway. And then I ended up modifying the filament temperature to better suit the types that I was using, but again, a pretty basic level setting, and for the most part I was actually lowering it because it seemed like it was going to be printing a bit hot for the speed that the machine was running at. I do also have to say, overall I was very happy with the software side of things. I mean, Prusa Slicer is the slicer that pretty much every other slicer is built off of these days, so it is a very well built and functional slicer. The only thing that I felt like was missing was the multi-plate feature. I'm just always working on big complex projects. There's hardly anything that I print that only ends up being a single build plate, so having the ability to lay out all the pieces that I need across multiple build plates and figure out my plan of attack when it comes to printing that project has just become a necessity for me. But even then, I still ended up using Prusa Slicer for the majority of all of the prints that you saw me make. I think the only one that I used Orca for was the Trooper helmet sign, and that was mostly just to see how Orca worked for this machine, and it seems to be doing a great job. I know this 3D printer does sort of look a bit crazy, probably because it's unlike any other printer that we're all used to seeing at this point, but there are just so many smart design choices that Prusa have made. For one, the segmented heat bed, which I don't know if I had a chance to mention in this video already, but as the name would suggest, the heat bed is in, I believe, 16 segments, and it means they can be individually controlled, and so the printer defaults to only warming up the segments that actually have a piece on them. So if any of my prints looked a bit strange in terms of placements on the build plate, it was because I was probably trying to keep it within as few of the build plate segments as possible so that it was being as energy efficient as possible. You know, I didn't need the printer to be heating up 2 segments in the back for the wipe tower and then like 4 more in the front for this other piece. It was just going to be better if I could just try and condense them all to the same like 4 segments or whatever, and they only being the ones that the printer was heating up. So just an insanely smart and also unique feature to Prusa machines. Most of the time when I'm discussing designs of 3D printers, I'm going on about how I just fully do not understand why a company would choose to do this particular thing, and that is absolutely not the case with these machines. You can tell that Prusa printers are designed by people that actually understand 3D printing and are making smart choices about it. I mean, like, look at the telescopic spool holders. Such an easy thing, but it makes so much sense. Another massive positive for this printer is there is great replacement part availability. So great, in fact, there's actually quite a lot of pieces that you could just 3D print yourself to replace them. Because yeah, this printer does involve quite a few 3D printed parts. In fact, all of them are included on the USB stick. I hadn't realized that beforehand. They're also all available online because that is what I ended up using for my extrusion rail cover for my camera. I ended up printing essentially another one of these just a little bit longer for that side cover. It really doesn't get more convenient than the ability to be able to 3D print your own replacement parts if it came to that. The Prusa XL can also work completely offline and is open source, which is always important to a lot of people, but I feel like even more so recently. So another massive positive for this printer, although I do have to say that it does equally work well online if you are somebody that is into Wi-Fi printing, remote sending of your print jobs. The app is also great. It's very useful in telling you if the printer is experiencing something that needs your attention, like maybe a filament has run out and you need to replace it, or if there's any sort of other error. But the majority of the time, the notifications that I was getting were the print job complete ones, which I am a big fan of so that I can maximize my time as much as possible. Another positive is the build volume on this machine. It is a 360mm cube, which is a great solid size for a ton of different types of projects. There is actually nothing that I tried putting on this machine that wouldn't fit. You'd easily be able to fit a full-size helmet on this machine in one go, no problem. And for any of my droid building lovers out there, you would pretty much fit any droid piece on this printer without issue as well. Obviously, the Prusa XL has a ton of things going for it. Really, I think there's only one con against it, but I have 2 things that are more points. I wouldn't go so far as to call them cons. They're more just like neutral points that I wanted to mention. The first thing is that the default print settings for this machine are at a slower speed than a lot of us have grown accustomed to with the ultra-fast printers that are what make up the majority of 3D printers these days. I do not personally see this as being a bad thing though. I've gone on pretty much the entire video about how flawlessly perfect these prints look, and a lot of that is probably because it's not going at the speed of light. I'm not saying that this machine can't print faster than what some of the default speed settings are at, but because it was producing such amazing looking prints, I just didn't feel the need to adjust any of them. And I feel like this is one of those machines that, especially if you are somebody that is looking at using it for multicolor prints, those are the prints that you want to be looking absolutely flawless. The thing that comes off of the printer is the finished product, so you want that thing looking as amazing as it possibly can. And this printer is producing those objects amazingly as it possibly can. Like, I really don't think you could get much better than the print quality that this machine has. The other thing that I do slightly wish is that this machine would already have a camera built in. That being said though, I do understand, I think, why it doesn't. There really isn't an obvious spot as to where you would put a camera on this machine, and so leaving it up to individual people if they are wanting a camera on their printer and them deciding where they want it to be on the machine, I do think is probably the best choice, which is why they went along with that. And that does mean that you can also go after a camera that would be possibly better than one that would be default on a 3D printer anyway. It was easy enough to stick one of my extra Wise cams onto the corner and just have its magnetic bottom stick to the side of the machine. Really the only thing that I missed out on was the ability to make super easy time lapses of my print jobs, but that is always, I feel like, something that is significantly more important to me making these videos than it would be for the average person using this printer. Another slight con is that setup and calibrations do take a while on this machine, even though this was technically the assembled version. Because it's just such a complex printer, it still can't be shipped in one piece. You do still have to be installing all of those hot ends, and of course when you do have the 5 tool head version, you're doing the same process 5 times, so it does take a while. I wouldn't say it's necessarily the most beginner friendly process, not because the process was particularly difficult to do or understand. I just don't think somebody just starting out in 3D printing probably wants to be putting themselves through that much assembly. And that brings us to what I feel like is really the only downside about the Prusa XL, and that is its cost. It is the most expensive 3D printer that I own. Now, there are single and dual tool head options that are less expensive than the full 5 tool heads, but I feel like the majority of people that are drawn to this machine are specifically interested in it for its 5 tool heads and the capabilities and benefits that come along with that. As I've mentioned throughout this video, this is such a unique printer that there's really nothing to compare it to, and that also includes the price. So I'm not about to sit here and tell you if something is worth it or not. I feel like that is a very personal judgment if you feel like the price of something is justified. I always just want my videos to be sharing the experiences that I have using particular machines, and also provide you with as much information as I possibly can, so you can take all of that to help you make your own informed opinion or decision. So if you are someone whose work constantly involves multi-material or multicolor prints, then the time and material savings that you can get with this machine might immediately justify the price for you. But then equally, you'll have someone that isn't the most prolific multicolor printer that the cost just won't be justified for them. To wrap this section up though, I do have to say that when I was using this machine, my dad did come down to the workshop to visit and also see this thing in action, and of course did pose the question of if I thought the printer was worth the cost. And I ended up just handing him this piece, which is actually the first version of the Battle Droid head that I started to print and then decided I didn't really like the filament color. So I handed him this random back of a Battle Droid head. He took a look at it and said, yeah, I guess it is worth it. But take the opinions of a random Canadian man that knows almost nothing about 3D printing for what you will. Overall, I think the Prusa XL is an absolutely amazing 3D printer. If you're somebody that has been looking into one of these for a while, then I don't think you would regret your purchase at all. It's an incredible printer on its own, just printing in a single color and the quality that it's able to achieve, but its standout feature by far is its ability to flip between its multiple tool heads for multiple print colors or multiple materials. If you are interested in finding out even more information about the Prusa XL, or interested in any of the things that you saw me printing in this video, there will be links to all of that in the description box. A massive thank you to Prusa for sending over the XL. If anyone had asked me, I would have said that the Prusa XL was probably my dream 3D printer, which I feel like the majority of my comment section is absolutely not surprised at, given how frequently it would be brought up every time I would complain about the waste that goes into multicolor printing. So I cannot tell you how excited I am to have this in the workshop, able to use now. I have an absolutely insane project plan that you will be seeing very soon. But that is everything. So thank you so much for watching, and and I will see you in my next video.